I'm here with Dr. Timothy Kneeland, Professor of History and Political Science and Director, Center for Public History at Nazareth College. He's here to tell us about the Great Migration. My name's Alex.
Good to meet you, Alex.
Thanks, you too. I would just like to ask you a few questions.
Absolutely.
The title of our expedition is What Makes Us Us? Conflict and Community. We are studying how conflict shapes our community and helps define who we are. How do you feel the Great Migration fits with the idea of conflict and community?
I think it's an excellent example of how people who want to join an existing community often face resistance from the people that are there. And the Great Migration is a good example of that, but we have earlier examples too. Migrations from people in Europe or outside of this community who come in and they have conflict because they bring in new ideas, new ways of doing things. And sometimes the existing population isn't welcoming at all for a variety of reasons: social, ethnicity, racism in the case of the African American community. And so they have conflict, and that's very normal. We often talk about, forming, storming, norming, performing. And it was clearly the case of African Americans who had to go through a kind of conflict higher than most, where there actually had to be an uprising in '64. But after that, there really was a greater sense of bonding and community between various constituents across the city of Rochester.
Okay. How did Rochester compare with other northern cities in regards to the Great Migration?
It was a little bit behind, if you will. I mean, the African American population here it grows during the first Great Migration before 1930, triples in size or so, but really was pretty late in time for attracting large numbers of African Americans. Very unreceptive on building public housing. I think it was the last city in upstate New York to actually build public housing for people who needed, housing, good housing, shelter. And it was clear that there was a real problem in the 37th Ward that the city was completely neglecting. And so I think we were a little bit behind, which makes us somewhat unique and may explain to some extent why so much frustration built up in the African American community.
What were the pull factors that caused African Americans to want to come to Rochester?
Well, clearly, the large-scale numbers coming in, say, 1940 and on, the Second Great Migration, the defense industry is number one. Rochester had become a defense town, contributed significantly to the Second World War effort, and there were jobs available. They were begging for people to come, and so African Americans began to be drawn up to Rochester. In the 1950s, the migration continues for other reasons: social reasons, preferences for housing and also education. There was a lot of things to be said about New York State's educational system. And family members or community members who were already here were writing back to places like Sanford, Florida, drawing people up and saying, the lifestyle here is good. The economy's not bad. There were jobs for African Americans, but they weren't always the best paying jobs. And that's going to cause frustration down the road.
Okay. How did Rochester treat newly arriving African Americans?
Well, the African American community within and of itself in the 37th Ward was very receptive, very welcoming. There were places where people could go, places like Mount Olivet Baptist that were repositories for social justice and places that might help you find employment. We were pretty late in getting an urban league actually in Rochester. So that wasn't here to help, but we had an NAACP office as well. And so that community was receptive. Sadly, the broader community, the power elite, very resistant, very unwelcoming, and in fact downright hostile to African Americans. African Americans couldn't really live outside of the 37th Ward, and trying to buy a house, the insurance companies, the banking community would not lend, would not give you insurance. And even if you could somehow find a house, there were things called covenants. They were secret agreements that when people bought houses out in the suburbs, they agreed that they would not sell those houses to African Americans or people who were Jewish or other groups that this majority white Anglo-Saxon Protestant did not want living in their suburbs. So it was a pretty hostile community.
Did the Great Migration have a major effect on the city of Rochester?
Oh, absolutely. Even now you can see the effects. That is, organizations like ABC, the Urban League in and of itself, FIGHT, the challenges to the existing structure that led to the creation of new kinds of schools, SOTA, other things. These were responses to African Americans bringing lawsuits or other things saying we are not integrating our schools. And the city fathers resisted, and they came up with a compromise plan, which we see today. But also many people in the community who are very powerful, people like David Gant, who his family came up during the Great Migration. He was a young man here, grew up. He's become a leader of this community, and not just of the African American community, but to everybody who lives in Rochester. So tremendously significant changes.
What role, if any, did the Great Migration play in the cause of the Rochester riots?
Clearly, the social pressures, the political pressures, the sense of oppression was felt greater during the 1960s because of the continuing coming of newcomers to this area, could not find good jobs, could not find good housing, and as a result, their frustration led to an uprising. So I do see a link, maybe not direct link, but clearly the reception of those newcomers, the intolerance and the oppression by some of our members of the police force led to an uprising, and that's going to change Rochester for the better.
What lessons can we learn from the Great Migration?
I think we need to study this because we need to understand how to make ourselves a more welcoming community. And I think one of the things is we have to banish ignorance of others. We really need to be a much more global society, much more multicultural. And this, I think, will lower barriers and fears, be it social stigmas, what have you, that would lead people to be intolerant or oppressive. I think if we do that, we can become a more embracing community. We'll always have a tiny bit of conflict. I mean, that's normal. But we won't have the kind of systemic conflict, systemic oppression, or the need for an uprising in the future.
We heard that the Great Migration is one of the most underreported historical moments. Why do you think this historical event is so underreported?
I think in general, if you look at African American history, really not, even though there was the Journal of Negro History started by Carter Woodson back in the 20s, and there was a move for a Black History Day or Black History Month eventually, but really, if you think about it, we've been very slow to incorporate the African American story into the broader narrative of American history. That, I think the Great Migration is an example of that. But the fact that you're learning about it indicates to me that, in fact, that's changing.
Thank you for coming in and telling us about the Great Migration and answering these questions.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Alice.
Welcome.